Before we start today's video, I'd like to take a moment and ask all of you watching this video a question. Let's pretend, for a moment, that you're on vacation and you're traveling somewhere new with your friends and family. Now, besides just seeing all the sights, what's the other thing you're probably doing while you're on vacation? Well, you most likely have either a smartphone or a digital camera in your hands, and you're using it to take photos and video of everything you see all around you while you're traveling. Everybody does this. Now, would you be surprised if I told you that over 100 years ago, even though it was nowhere near as commonplace as what we have today, people were doing the exact same thing? There were, in fact, small portable cameras that you could easily take with you and use them to take photos of your travels. And would you also be surprised if I told you that some of the most historically significant photos we have of the Titanic were taken by amateur photographers and not professional photographers hired by the White Star Line? Now, there are professional photos of the Titanic. They do exist, but some of the most historically important photos of the ship were in fact taken by amateur photographers. Now, what I thought I would do for today's video is tell the story of one of these amateur photographers that took some of the most amazing photos of the Titanic while it was on its maiden voyage. Yes, you heard me right. He was on board the Titanic during its maiden voyage, and he did survive. But it's also important to note that he was not on board the ship when it sank. He got on board the Titanic in Southampton, and he got off in Queenstown, the Titanic's final port of call before it headed out into the Atlantic. Now, this man, he has quite the story to tell, and his photos of the Titanic are absolutely unbelievable. And if you've studied the Titanic at all, chances are you've seen his photos and didn't even realize it. So join me in today's video as we tell the story of Francis Browne, the man who is responsible for taking some of the most historically significant photos we have of the Titanic. Francis Browne was born on January 3rd, 1880, and he would live out his life as a priest with the Catholic Church. Now, Francis Browne's religion was extremely important to him, but you see, on top of his religion, he also had another interest. He was extremely passionate about photography. He loved taking photos everywhere he went. And you see, it was this one trait that would make him famous in the eyes of history. Now, even from a young age, Francis Browne was extremely dedicated to whatever he was working on. This was very much noticeable when he was in college and when he was first starting out his career. Now, someone else who had noticed how hard Francis Browne had been working was his uncle. And, just like Francis Browne's uncle also shared his love for photography. Over the course of his life, Francis Browne's uncle had always been trying to help the guy out by buying him new cameras and so on and so forth. Now, in 1912, Francis Browne was a priest in training, and you see, his uncle once again had been so impressed by how far Francis had come over the course of his life that he decided to give him a present. He booked Francis a first-class cabin on the world's biggest and most luxurious ship, the Titanic. He was going to sail on board the Titanic from Southampton, England to Queenstown, Ireland. Now, when Francis got the news that he was going to get to sail on board the Titanic, he was absolutely thrilled. This would also be Francis's very first time on board an ocean liner. He boarded a train in London on April 10th, 1912 to go to Southampton to meet the Titanic. Now, since Francis wasn't one to let the chance for photography pass him by, he also took his Kodak Vest camera with him so he could document everything he saw during his short stay on board the brand new RMS Titanic. Now, Francis Browne's train arrived in Southampton at 11:30 a.m., just 30 minutes before the Titanic was due to leave port. Now, once the train pulled into the station, Francis met up with one of his friends, and the two of them together went to go to the Titanic. Now, Francis's friend was not going to sail on board the Titanic with him. However, where Francis was sailing on board the ship, the White Star Line was okay with friends and family members of those sailing on the ship to accompany them on board so they could check out the ship together, but the friend would have to leave before the Titanic left port. The two of them boarded the ship, took a quick look around, and they even made their way to Francis's cabin, which was A37. And then, since Francis was who he was, of course he had to take a quick photo of his cabin that you're seeing right now on the screen. After they did this, Francis's friend left the Titanic, and then Francis went up to the boat deck to watch the Titanic as it departed Southampton to begin its maiden voyage. Right after the Titanic started up her engines, Francis said that he heard a sound that he first thought were gunshots, but it turns out that these sounds he was hearing were the mooring lines for another ship, the SS New York, beginning to snap one by one. You see, after the Titanic started up her engines, the suction generated by the ship had caused the mooring lines of the New York to fail, and after this happened, the New York began to drift straight towards the Titanic, threatening to hit the ship. However, due to some quick actions by Captain Smith and some tugboats that were in the area, the Titanic just barely avoided a collision with the New York. However, when Francis saw all of this go down, he, once again, did not let the opportunity for a great photograph pass him by. He took several photographs of the New York being pulled away from the Titanic, one of which you see here on screen. Now, Francis Browne would not have that much time on board the Titanic. The Titanic should arrive in Queenstown roughly 24 hours or so after it left Southampton. But even still, even though he knew his time on the Titanic was brief, Francis was determined to make the most out of his stay on board the ship. Now, with a letter of introduction, Francis was able to make friends with the Titanic's head purser, a man by the name of Hugh McElroy, and he was able to convince Hugh to give him a tour of the Titanic. And while Hugh was doing this, as you can expect, Francis was busy taking as many photos as he could of the Titanic. And you see, the thing about Francis is he was so careful with what he took photos of, and he really did try to make his photos capture what the Titanic was all about, you know? Like, he paid close attention to the subject matter of each photo. Like, he took this unbelievable photograph of the Titanic's boat deck where you can see the funnels. He took this other awesome photograph of the Titanic's promenade deck. There's the famous photo he took of the couple on deck, and you all have definitely seen this picture before. He was the one who took the photo of the third-class child playing with the top on the Titanic's deck. So, I mean, as you can see, he took some of the most amazing photos of the Titanic, and it was his ultimate goal to try to paint a picture of what life was like on the Titanic through his photographs. So, as you can see, Francis Browne was basically kind of like a kid in a candy store when he was on board the Titanic. He was just running all around the ship, seeing as much stuff as he could, and taking as many photos as he could. And honestly, can you blame him? Listen, I know for a fact that if I was in his shoes and I was on board the Titanic and I only had a very limited amount of time on board, I'd be going everywhere and taking as many photos as I can. I can picture myself now going, ooh, what's that? Click. Ooh, what's that? Click. Ooh, what's that? Click. And just having fun. Now, anyway, when it came time for dinner, Francis Browne went to the first class dining room. And when he was there, believe it or not, he took another photo. And this picture here is one of the only photos that we know of the first class dining room. And you see, we're very fortunate to have this photo because don't forget, in the first class section of Titanic, it was a very high class place, and there were a lot of social rules you needed to follow. And honestly, by Francis Browne taking that photo, well, a lot of the other passengers in there could have seen what he was doing as very rude. So the fact that he had the guts to take this picture, I mean, we're lucky to have the photo, if you know what I mean. So, I mean, Francis Browne had some guts. That's all I gotta say about that. Anyway, after he sat down and was eating dinner, he made friends with an American couple that was sitting at the same table as him. And you see, when this couple found out that he was getting off in Queenstown, well, they liked him so much that, believe it or not, they offered to pay his way for him to go all the way to New York City on board the Titanic. The only thing they wanted in exchange was the pleasure of his company throughout the rest of the voyage. And honestly, Francis liked the idea. He was like, well, I need to check with my boss first. So, you know, if he gives the green light with that, then sure, I'd be happy to stay on board. So the couple escorted Francis Browne to the Marconi room, where, of course, Francis took another photo, as seen right here. And when he was there, he sent a message to his boss and asked him if he could stay on board the Titanic. And it's kind of funny when you think about it. As soon as Francis's boss got the request to stay on board the ship, he sent a very abrupt reply. And basically the only thing he said in the message was, "Get off that ship," in all caps. So, I mean, he's like, don't even think about it. I'm sorry, it's just, when I think about that, you know how today, if somebody asks somebody to do something over text message, we send a very abrupt reply like, no, you can't do that, don't even think about it. Well, This basically happened to Francis in 1912, and it's funny to think about it. And apparently he got such a kick out of that message, he then went around the Titanic and showed it to all of his friends. He just thought it was hilarious. Now, early the next morning, Francis Browne woke up, grabbed his camera, and then once again headed out to go and see what was going on board the Titanic. He was really trying to make the most out of every minute he had on board the ship. Now, it seems like that when he was exploring, he may have made an interesting discovery, because it seems like that the Titanic's crew were doing some maneuverability tests during the morning of April the 11th, and we know this thanks to a photograph taken by Mr. Browne. You see this photo right here? Well, it shows a very interesting wake coming off of the back of the Titanic's stern. So it seems like the Titanic's crew were doing some maneuverability tests with the ship before it arrived in Queenstown. Now, the Titanic arrived in Queenstown at some point between 10 and 10:30 a.m. And you see, it's also important to note that just like what happened in Cherbourg, when the Titanic arrived, it did not go all the way up to the pier. Instead, what they did was they just had the Titanic hang out further out in the bay, and then they had two small tender boats, the American and the Ireland, take passengers to the Titanic, and they were also going to use these tender boats to take people from the Titanic back to Queenstown. Now, many people like to say that this was because the Titanic was too big for the pier in Queenstown. However, this isn't the case. The Titanic could fit there. However, the reason they decided to keep the ship out in the bay was due to turnaround time. They wanted to get the Titanic back out to sea as quickly as possible, and it'd be a lot faster to do it this way instead of bringing it up to the pier. Now, Mr. Browne got off the Titanic on one of these two small tender boats, but of course, never missing an opportunity to take pictures, he snapped several photos as he was leaving the Titanic, including this one you see right here. And what's so significant about this photo is, if you look carefully, you can see Captain Smith watching the two tender boats from the Titanic's boat deck. And as far as we know, this is the last confirmed photo of Captain Smith, taken by Father Browne as he was leaving the Titanic. Now, several days later, Francis Browne would learn that the unthinkable had happened. The Titanic had sunk. And when he learned this, he knew that his photos would be of great interest to people since they really did capture what life was like on board the Titanic. So he made arrangements to sell his photos to several different newspaper companies, and then these companies published his photos and shared them with people all around the world. Now, his photos became so popular that, I kid you not, the Eastman Kodak Company offered him free film for all of his cameras for life. Now, as I previously stated, Father Browne was not the only person to take photos on board the Titanic during the maiden voyage. There were others who did this. But even so, we cannot deny how impressive his photos are and how important they are in all of us learning more about the Titanic today. Because what you have to remember is the Titanic was not a well-documented ship. Where the Titanic and the Olympic were so similar, the White Star Line really didn't see the need to take a ton of photos of the Titanic. And it's thanks to amateur photographers like Father Browne that we have so many photos of the Titanic today. And if they didn't do what they did, then honestly, we really wouldn't know anywhere near as much about the Titanic as we do now. So we really do owe a lot to Father Browne and all those who took pictures of the Titanic when she was sailing on her maiden voyage. Anyway, guys, hey, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this video about Francis Browne. If you did enjoy this video, be sure you leave it a like. And if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. And thank you guys so much for being here. You all are awesome. Oh, and hey, don't forget to subscribe to the Historic Hangout channel where we just chill out and play video games. Link for that in the description. Y'all take care, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, everybody. Special thanks to our Captain Level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.